to the lunch bar. There's some seats down the front here if you guys want to grab a seat. But yeah, just welcome. I hope you're all enjoying the food. This is an event put on by the Manchester University Christian Union. We're having a week of events looking at common objections to Christianity. So for this lunch bar, what we're going to be talking about is God invented it. Is there any evidence for him? So the format's going to be, we're going to have a talk, and there'll be a number on the screen that you can text in your questions. So I've got a phone on me, and at the end we have a time where we'll be asking Michael these questions, so we can really grapple with issues that you have. We'll be finished by 10 to 1, so if you've got to run off to a lecture, that's fine, we'll be, you can do that, that's fine. So I'm just going to invite Michael up here. Can you tell us who you are and what you do, just as an introduction?
I'm Michael. I come from Bournemouth. I do things like this, actually. I go around universities around the UK and Europe, working with groups like the Christian Union here, helping explain something of the content of the Christian faith and answering some of the main questions and objections that people might have.
Great, thank you. Next slide.
Great, yeah. Fantastic. Well, welcome back. If you were here yesterday, welcome for the first time, obviously, if you weren't. And just to say, we will have questions in 20 minutes' time. And, oh, it's disappeared. It will come, I hope, on the corner of the screen in a minute when Gavin's not pulled the cable out. But there'll be a number on the corner of the screen as we go through the talk. Please do feel free to text into that. We'll get through as many questions at the end as possible. And we'll do that. So do text as you go through. And we'll see how we go. But we're looking particularly at this idea of the invented God. Is there any evidence for him? A few months ago now, I was getting my hair cut down in Bournemouth, where I live, and the lady cutting my hair was chatting to me, and we're having a conversation about all sorts of things. And then, in the middle of the conversation, she said this. She discovered that I was a Christian, and she heard a little bit about what I do. She said to me, "I really admire your faith." I thought that was a very interesting thing for her to say. Quite a compliment, I thought. She didn't admire my face, but my faith is a good second bet, isn't it? So I really admire your faith. So I'm thinking, what do I say next? Then I said to her, how would you define faith? What would you say it is? And she thought for a moment, and as she's clipping my hair, she said, I think faith is the ability to believe things that are not true. And then I thought to myself, actually, I'm not sure that's such a compliment after all, is it? I admire your ability to believe untrue things. I said to her, actually, I would take that rather as a bit of an insult, that I should believe stuff like that. Because no one wants to believe things that aren't true. But particularly in the post-Enlightenment West, for many, the idea of faith has become belief in that which is untrue, or that for which there is no evidence. And of course, most of us, and I would agree with you, don't want to believe things that are either not true, or that which is just like a fairy tale, something that's just made up. Is there any evidence for God? One of the other problems we have when we come to this question is, for most people that I meet, or many people rather that I meet, a common reaction is to say, well, since the theory of evolution, there is no need for God. We don't need God, evolution explains everything. This isn't a talk on evolution, and there's lots of interesting things we could say on that one. But it's fascinating, actually, that a philosopher, an American philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, in recent years, has put forward the evolutionary argument against not God, but naturalism. And he's shown quite interestingly that evolution, if true, defeats not necessarily the existence of God, but actually the opposite. And it's interesting that there are atheists that agree with him. So John Gray, an atheist from London, said this, Gavin. He said, modern humanism is the faith that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success and not truth. See, it's fascinating. He said, if evolution is true, why should we trust the products of our minds if they're the products of unguided mindless processes? Interestingly, Charles Darwin said this himself in a letter to someone. He said, but then with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the conviction of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? So if that's all we are, the product of an unguided process, then why should we trust our rational capacities at all? That's not what we've evolved for. Another issue on this whole question about God is, which God are we looking for evidence for anyway? Yesterday, in fact, in the question time afterwards, this came up. The idea that God is somehow a God of the gaps. And people say, well, if God is a God of the gaps, then we don't need that kind of God anymore. By God of the gaps, we're basically saying, rewind a couple of thousand years to the Greeks, maybe they didn't understand as much as we do about science. So what they did is they attributed to God, or the gods, the things that science couldn't explain at the time. We don't understand thunder and lightning, so let's say there are some gods having a domestic in the clouds, throwing lightning bolts at each other. And we look at such primitive ideas and we say, how ridiculous. We now know all of this stuff, we don't need God. God is a God of the gaps. And in that kind of thinking, the more we understand about science, the less we would need God. They're directly opposed to each other. But what I'm not seeking today, and what Christianity has never believed in, is a God of the gaps. That would be a completely different idea about God altogether. A God that would be very definitely opposed to advances in scientific knowledge. But the God of the Bible has never been understood as such. I'll give you an illustration. Have you ever used one of these? An air blade. Okay? How exciting are Dyson air blades? I mean, I remember, the old fancy kind of air blade, air dryer things you got. You'd stand there for like half an hour just warming up your hands but never getting them dry. But then air blades came along. They're just amazing, aren't they? I remember the first time I used one, I washed my hands a second time, just to time how long it took to get them dry. It is fascinating, incredible. And I'm thinking, how on earth do those air blades work? How do they do it so fast? How do they project the air so well? And then I noticed that on them it has this word Dyson. It says Dyson. I'm thinking to myself, Dyson, okay, who is this Dyson being of the air blade variety? And where does he live? And so I've come up with a theory. Maybe Mr. Dyson is a little man who runs around inside the air blade. And he knows when the toilet flush, that's his sign to cue into action, right? And he runs into action, and he runs around really fast, blowing as fast as he can, when I put my hand in the gap. Of course, that's ridiculous, isn't it? And that's not where Mr. Dyson lives. In fact, he lives down in the south of England. He's about 70 years old, and that's him using an air blade. Mr. Dyson doesn't live in the vacuum cleaner. He doesn't do the things that I don't understand. He invented the vacuum cleaner. And the internal workings of the air blade, the internal workings of the air blade are not in contradiction to the existence of Mr. Dyson. Understanding how it works doesn't remove the need for him. They're complementary, not contradictory. And the Bible says that God is not the God who does the little things that we don't understand, but he is the God who set everything in motion. He is the creator. And so the more we understand about how our universe works through science, in no way removes the need for a God who created it in the first place. And that's been fascinating to see through history. If you look at someone, Isaac Newton, for instance, who wrote about the law of gravity. What did Isaac Newton conclude when he discovered and wrote about the law of gravity? Did he say, now we understand the law of gravity, we don't need God? No, he wrote this book, Principia Mathematica, and in it he said, I am seeking to persuade the thinking person to believe in the existence of God. Because he understood how it worked. He didn't say, I don't need God, he appreciated that God even more. And that means that actually, when we're not talking about God of the gaps, but the God of the Bible, we're not threatened by science. Actually, historically, there have been many great Christians that have been leading scientists in different fields. And they sought to understand the world, and in understanding the world, they had a greater appreciation of the God who made it. So it's not a God of the gaps. But is there any evidence for God? Three things really to say before we open it up to questions. Firstly, the universe exists. It's interesting that if you go back about 50, 60 years, many people who were of an atheist worldview and mindset would have said, we don't need God because the universe has always existed. Now, there were various philosophical problems that you had with the idea of an eternal universe, but still the idea was commonly believed. But up to a certain point, that was okay, until, of course, the theory of the Big Bang was put forwards. And when the theory of the Big Bang was put forward, people realised that the universe hasn't always existed. There was a start point to the universe in space and time, from which space and time came into existence. And that raised problems Not primarily, I would suggest, for theists, those who do believe in God, but bigger problems for atheists, those who don't. Because if the universe had a beginning point, it raised the very big question, what caused that universe to begin in the first place? It's interesting, if you look at someone like this guy, Sir Arthur Eddington, you may not have heard of him, but it was one of his students that first put forward certain ideas that led to the theory of the Big Bang. When he heard about this, as a materialist in terms of worldview, he really struggled with the implications of what this might mean. So he said, philosophically, the notion of a beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. I should like to find a genuine loophole. And much of the resistance to this advance in science didn't come from Christians, but actually from those of materialistic worldview who couldn't fit these two things together. And I would suggest it's still a problem today. I would take someone like Richard Dawkins. How does he explain the idea of a beginning to the universe? Well, one of the suggestions is maybe the universe is an oscillating universe. The universe is continually expanding and contracting. But how do we know? Because we can't go back beyond the Big Bang and see what happens. So it's a faith position of a very blind variety, I would suggest, because there's no way that we could know whether that theory is true. Or look at someone like Stephen Hawking. He said in his most latest book this: because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Now, what's one of the problems with that statement? Well, there's a couple at least. Firstly, the law of gravity is not nothing, it is something, isn't it? And secondly, laws do not create. I would love to say that the laws of arithmetic will create me a fortune, but they won't, okay? Laws don't create, they explain. And although he suggests that we remove the need for God, I'm not sure we have. And so actually, the very fact that this universe had a beginning, and there is a universe at all, should make us ask big questions, and maybe a clue towards the question of God's existence. Here's the second thing. The universe exists, but secondly, morality exists as well. It's interesting that universally around the world, although there is often disagreement over exactly what is right and what is wrong, there is never been a culture discovered that hasn't had some sense of right and wrong. This idea that there is a right and there is a wrong and there is a differentiation between them. And the question is, why? Now, I have to be very careful here, because some people understand Christians and others as saying this: only Christians can differentiate between right or wrong, or only Christians can do good things. And I am not saying that. I believe everybody is created in God's image. So everybody, Christian or not, is well able to differentiate between right and wrong. It's written on our hearts, not just in the Bible. And actually, there are often many atheists that put Christians to shame by their levels of morality. So I am not saying that, but I am asking the question, if you take God out of the picture, what is the basis for the difference between right and wrong? Where does that come from? And historically, that's been a very big question. If you look at someone like David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, he really grappled with this, because he said, well, what you really can't do is get an ought from an is. That is to say, if all we have is the materialistic universe that we observe, how can we get moral imperatives from that? How can we say what ought to be or what ought not to be? We can only observe what is. Let me give you an example. Let me just show you a picture. Sorry, the head's been chopped off, and so have the arms. There you go. This is Venus de Milo, famous statue. Now, if I were to show you this statue, I wonder what you would say. If I said to you, what do you see? What do you see in that statue? I wonder what you would say. Now, I have to be careful. If I say this to high school students, they normally say breasts. But I'm taking it that you're slightly more advanced. And so you might say something like this. Well, I see a woman with her arms chopped off. A woman without arms. And I would say to you, well, that's very interesting. I just see a lump of rock. How do you see a woman with her arms chopped off? Why do you say that? And it's because you have a standard of what you think a woman ought to look like. You know this isn't quite what a woman normally looks like. You see? You can tell that something is wrong because you have some sense of what it should be. And in the same way, Hume is saying that actually if there is no God, there is no oughts, there is just is. And we can't get moral imperatives, absolute moral imperatives from that. So he said actually our moral imperatives are just relative. Society debates and decides what is right or wrong for itself. Of course, that leaves us with very big problems. If Nazi Germany had won the Second World War, would the Holocaust now be okay because our society would have been governed by a group or a country that believed that it was at the time? I would like to believe that actually what they did was wrong, even if they had won the Second World War and brainwashed us all into thinking that it was otherwise. And so actually, increasingly, people are saying the idea of relative morality just doesn't work, particularly when we see the horrific things that have been done over the last 100 or so years. And so even amongst atheists, people like Richard Dawkins or the late Christopher Hitchens, there's a movement now to say we need to have absolute moral values. But how? And that's the big question. And so take someone like Richard Dawkins, and he would talk about moral values being dictated by evolution. We've evolved to decide what is right or wrong. And that can work to an extent. It explains a certain amount of things, but it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain, for instance, certain altruistic behaviours. Why would I, for instance, love and be faithful to a wife who couldn't bear children in a purely evolutionary world? Wouldn't make sense. And he accepts that there are things that don't seem to make sense. And so he says this. He says these things are misfirings, Darwinian mistakes, blessed, precious mistakes. Then he says we're built as gene machines, and we have the power to turn against our creators. We alone on earth can rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators. But I want to ask the question, are some of our greatest values and virtues simply misfirings of evolution? Is that all they are? And if we are just the products of our genes and nothing more, then how on earth can we rebel against them? It doesn't seem to make sense. There are other people that have tried to get around this. People like Sam Harris, more recently in The Moral Landscape. He said, well, basically, we can say that well-being of human beings is the greatest good, and so whatever increases and enhances well-being for the greatest number of people is good. And so we can scientifically analyse that and come up with a scientific, non-theistic basis for morality. But again, there's various issues with that. He seeks in an a priori assumption that well-being is the best good. Now, that might be intuitively right, but is it true? And there are lots of people, many of them not Christians, who have real problems with his theory. For instance, look at biologist P.Z. Myers. He says, I don't think Harris's criterion that we can use science to justify maximising the well-being of individuals is valid. We can't. We can certainly use science to say how we can maximise well-being once we define well-being, although even that might be a bit more slippery than he portrays it. Harris is smuggling in an unscientific prior in his category of well-being. Now, it might be complicated, don't worry if you don't understand it all if you've not read the book. But it's basically saying there are difficulties, I think fatal difficulties, in trying to build an absolute morality without the need for God. Actually, the assumption and the conviction, I would say, is that we have absolute morals because they're given to us by a moral, rational, and reasonable God in the first place. Now, you might be saying, okay, the universe, morality, I'm up for debate on those, but they're not that compelling and not necessarily convincing, and that's okay. They might be clues towards the existence of God, but is there anything more? It was interesting, I was reading recently of this guy, Billy Connolly, and he said this, I don't know if God exists. It seems unlikely to me, but then does a trout know that I exist? Very succinctly put. And it's very fascinating, because he's saying, look, if I was a fish, I might not know about the existence of Billy Connolly, but then how could I know about the existence of Billy Connolly? We're talking about two very different beings, aren't we? One is a hairy Scottish comedian and the other is wet and swims in water, okay? How would they know? And it raises very interesting questions. If there is a God who created the universe and created us, how on earth would we know anything about him at all? We could look in clues philosophically and scientifically at the universe and morality, but they would only be clues, and they may not be conclusive. We would actually need that God to reveal himself to us. And that is, I would say, the unique and the massive claim of Christianity, that God has in fact done that. He didn't just give us clues and signposts, but he revealed himself historically in the person of Jesus. The claim is that Jesus wasn't just a prophet pointing to God, but God in human form on planet Earth. And that he did and said the kind of things that only God could do and say. He claimed to forgive sins. He accepted people's worship. He claimed that he and God were one, that if you'd met him, you'd met God. And then he didn't just make great claims, but he backed it up by the things that he did, and in particular, his own resurrection from the dead, a unique event in all of history. Now, I know when I say that, this raises all sorts of questions. How do I know the claims of the New Testament are true? We'll stick around for the second lunch bar. We're going to look at the reliability and the historical claims of the Bible. How do I know the resurrection happens? That's a very good question. We're going to look at that on Friday night in detail and the implications as well. But if these things are true, and if the Christian claim is true, it does make a massive claim. The claim is the God who exists has revealed himself. And so the question about Jesus is not a peripheral or irrelevant one, but the biggest and most relevant one of all. Which is why I have to say I was really disappointed reading a book like The God Delusion when there's only 4 or 5 pages devoted to it. When this would be the biggest and most massive claim to investigate. Who is Jesus? Because if Jesus is who he claims to be, it answers 2 very big questions. Firstly, is there a God? But also secondly, what is God like? Because as we look at the person of Jesus, we see not only the existence of God, but something of the character of God demonstrated. Now, I think this is really important, because many people I meet who say to me, I don't believe in God. When I press it and ask why, I discover the reason why they don't is their idea of God is a very negative thing. You know, it's a Hitler in the heavens or a Stalin in the sky, an evil dictator that's unjust in all that he does. And of course, if your idea of God is wholly negative, you won't want God to exist, will you? You'll be very predisposed to all the evidence against it. But what if actually God was quite different to that? And I think what we see in Jesus is that God is so different to our ideas and expectations of what we think he might be like. Just let me finish with this. Matthew Paris, columnist in the Times, an atheist, interestingly, but he wrote this in an article, I think it was last year. He said, one of the reasons we can be pretty sure Jesus actually existed is that if he had not, the church would have never invented him. That's fascinating. You see, the God and the Jesus that so often we're sold in our re-lessons, our media and our society, is a God and a Jesus that is so different to the God that I discover in the pages of the New Testament. And so my encouragement to you would be, check out the person of Jesus. Not only because it's a great primary source and it's the best place to go if you want to intellectually look and observe and investigate the evidence, but also because I think the Jesus that you find there and the God that he reveals is so different to your expectations. A God who doesn't hobnob with the rich and famous, but welcomes the outcast. A God who doesn't want to set up and pander to the religious leaders of his day, but a God who challenges the religious hypocrisy of his day and wants to bring people into relationship with himself. A God that so often turns our expectations about himself on their head, as it were. So investigate for yourself. These aren't free, by the way, they're yours to take away, and they are just one of the accounts of the life of Jesus. And if you're here today, and even if you're still saying, look, I don't think there's anything in this, I would encourage you to read it, because for the sake of credibility, it'd be worth checking out one of the primary sources. In the next lunch bar, Julia is going to be looking at some of the historical reasons why we can treat this as a historical source, and not just a religious text. So you do stick around for that. But take it and have a read for yourself. But as I've said, if Jesus reveals God to us, investigating Jesus would be a really good thing to do. And after this week is finished, there's going to be lots of opportunities for you to do that with a course, actually called Uncover, that's going to be taking place over the course of 6 weeks. And we would love you to come to that course, an opportunity to answer questions, investigate for yourself, and really get your nose into the evidence, as it were, and see what you think for yourself. And there's also a bookstall at the back, and the bookstall has got all sorts of books. This book, The Case for Christ, looks particularly at the evidence for Jesus, the New Testament, and the resurrection. Very helpful, that, written by a journalist who started out as a real skeptic, but investigated for himself the evidence for Jesus. And this book by John Lennox, Professor of Mathematics at Oxford, has debated on a number of occasions, people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, God's Undertaker, a science-bearer God. If that's particularly your issue, I would say that book will be especially helpful for you. It's well thought through and well explained. And all the books on the bookstall are £1 if you're not part of the Christian Union. Okay? So, we're going to go to questions, and we've got 15 minutes for that. Whilst we're doing the questions, can I just get you to do one other thing? There should be Anyway, it's gone. In your book, a little feedback form like this. Can you just pick that up and grab it now? And on the back of that little card, it's got some space for you to write some comments. And we would love every day for you to just write some comments about how you found the events and what you thought of it. So do just grab the cards now and fill those out. There's some more pizza coming around at the same time, so that's your reward for filling it out. But do fill it out, leave us your comments. And then on the front side, if you would like more information, particularly about this course that we're going to be running called Uncover, where you can come and investigate the claims of Jesus, it's not going to be religious in the sense of singing songs or praying. It's just going to be an investigative course where you can look at the evidence and ask your questions. Tick the box that says "Tell me more." Okay, and then if you tick the box, then leave your name and your contact number, and we'll get back and let you know about when and where that's going to be in the next 24 hours. Okay, so everyone can leave comments, whoever you are, whether you've come before, whether you come normally. And then if you want to find out more, tick "Tell me more" and leave your details on the front. And then there'll be a box at the end as you leave, and you can leave them in the box. Okay, great. We've got questions? We have, fantastic. We'll dive straight in.
Okay, so the first one, I'll do them in the order that they came in. So you argued that evolution created our mind to be successful, not to seek the truth. So how would you explain the idea that evolution created the need for a God in humans? Or was that also a byproduct of another evolutionary induced?
Okay. So did evolution create the need for God in human beings? It'd be very interesting to look at that, because often people say, well, religion is just kind of evolutionary construct. What's fascinating is that belief in God is not something that kind of appeared at one stage, but actually we'd say seems to have been there all along. Look at any culture and society around the world. Some belief in the supernatural is there. There's never been a purely atheistic culture that's been discovered. And it's fascinating because some people suggested about 10, 15 years ago that the belief in God in the West would decline, that atheism would be on the ascendancy, the belief in God would decline. And there has been an increase in atheism, but there's also been an increase in belief in traditional kind of Orthodox Christianity as well. So that's not happened either. So it's not necessarily happened as we might expect. So I don't think we could say that evolution necessarily has explained away our need for or our creation of God. It kind of relates to the issues we were looking at yesterday. Is God just a psychological crutch, kind of a Freudian argument? So do listen to the talk yesterday. If it is, though, the product of evolution, something that we've evolved to create to advance society, this belief in God, it does make it rather fascinating to me that evolutionists like Richard Dawkins are so angry at religion. Because if religion is just a product of evolution, then why should we be angry at it? Particularly if it's had positive benefits through history. And what he often fails to see is many of the positive benefits of it. I would say, of course, the question of evolution doesn't answer conclusively whether there is or isn't a God. It does raise interesting questions both ways. And that's where I would say the revelation of God in Jesus and the historical evidence of the resurrection is something very objective that we can really get stuck into and think about for ourselves as well. Okay. So I want to come back on that quickly before we get to the next one. I think we've got a number of them. Okay, we'll get to the next question.
Okay. So this one's about the morality and the argument for God. So for me, morality is enough. I believe that I have sufficient morality intrinsically. Why should I seek God?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking. And I would just reiterate what I said at the beginning of my point, that second point, that what I'm not saying is that you need to believe in God or to be a Christian to make moral judgments. Okay? What I am saying is, if there is no God, what is the basis for that morality? What's the logical worldview basis for it? Okay? It's a bit like saying, to give a silly illustration, I may not believe in the existence of power stations. I may believe that there are fairies in the sky that produce electricity. But my wrong belief about the power stations isn't going to stop me plugging my mobile phone in and charging it at the socket, okay? But actually I've got a wrong belief. It's not actually true, okay? And what I would say is, if I take God out of the picture, how can I get a basis for objective and absolute moral values? And I think the answer is we can't, okay? I'm not saying, can we make moral judgments? Yes, we can. But I think that actually they're inconsistent with the worldview. Yeah, there's a question back. Feel free to.
So where would you argue that the morals come from God? How does he give them to us?
Okay, great. Good. So how do we get that morality then? Because clearly there are lots of people that have morality that haven't read the Bible. You know. And it's interesting, I mentioned this yesterday, I'll say it again. In the New Testament, in the book of Romans, Romans chapter 2, it talks about people in the world who obviously don't know the Bible, haven't read God's law, as it were, in the Old Testament, but still have a sense of right and wrong. And it says that God has written his law, as it were, into our conscience, on our hearts. And so because the Bible says we're created in God's image, every person is, that sense of right and wrong is an inbuilt thing onto our conscience. And so it doesn't therefore matter whether I've read the Bible or not. Everybody can have some sense of that. So the Bible is not surprised by that. Yeah, sure.
You can't really, I mean, that's a crucial thing, so that's what it's debating about. But there are many things in the Bible which have got hideous morals. The Old Testament is full of them. And the New Testament isn't as good either, really. Is it? There are lots of things about Jesus says, which are good from a moral standpoint, as you said, but they advocate, that they do go back to the Old Testament. He does mention it a couple of times. So how would you explain the Old Testament yourself? Do you believe it?
Yeah.
Do you see it as a metaphor?
Yeah. Good question. It's a big question. I know we've got others, so I'll try and answer it. And we can carry on discussing afterwards if you'd like. Basically, there's a couple of things that I would say. Firstly, because the Bible describes something, it doesn't necessarily prescribe something. So everything that's described in the Old Testament isn't saying this is a kind of moral example. Actually, there are lots of examples of things that are very bad in the Old Testament. Just because it's explained doesn't mean saying this is good. The other thing to say is that actually as a Christian I would understand that I'm not under the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law was for a specific people in a specific context. And when you start to understand that this was a nation wandering in the wilderness and stuff like that, some of those laws start to make sense given the worldview they're in. And Jesus says actually that we're not under that law. As Christians we follow Jesus himself. He has fulfilled the Old Testament law, but we don't have to kind of go through and tick off the Old Testament laws. The other thing I would say is, when we look at the Old Testament law, we need to understand, again, in the context of the society and the situation that we're in. Often what we do is we read in 21st century Britain to 20th century BC, Palestine or whatever, and they're very different contexts as well. I know there were comebacks. We've also got more questions. Have we on text? Can we just take the other question on the text so we can do that one first, because we're just a bit short on time. It's not that we're not wanting to answer your question, we just want to make sure we get through all of the others as well.
So this one's about God, when God reveals himself to us through Jesus. So the question is, why did God choose to reveal himself to a desert tribe in the Middle East rather than the more advanced Chinese civilization at that time?
Okay, yeah. So I guess particularly we're talking about the ways that God has revealed himself, in the Old Testament to the nation of Israel. Why didn't God reveal himself to another people at another time? And then when we come to the person of Jesus, why did God decide to turn up in the person of Jesus 2,000 years ago in the Middle East, not at some other place and some other time? In one sense, if God is going to turn up as a human being, it is always going to be very specific, isn't it? It's going to be in one place, not another place, at one time, not another time. So you could always ask, could it have been another time? Well, yes. But that doesn't get away from the fact, well, what do I make of the evidence for Jesus 2,000 years ago? Why did God turn up 2,000 years ago in the Middle East? I think actually there are some very interesting historical and social reasons why I think that was a particularly good time. For instance, the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire, and the peace that was known across Europe, from Britain right down to the Middle East, was something that was not going to be known again for over 1,000 years. And it's interesting that actually at that stage, with a common language, with the possibility for travel, if God was going to reveal himself at any point up to kind of in the last few years, that point in history and that place in history was not a bad place to do it, given the ability for that message then to spread right across the known world, as in fact it did do and has done. So I think there are, looking on a kind of human level, some potentially good reasons why the incarnation, this is the biblical term to talk about God becoming human, could have taken place then. Could it have happened some other time? Well, yeah, of course it could. It doesn't get away from the fact of, well, what do I make of the evidence? What do I make of Jesus? Now, we can always say, do we have more evidence? Could we have more evidence? And we could say, well, yeah, the evidence is not exhaustive, but is the evidence sufficient? And that's the important question. And, well, we'll look at it in the next session when we look at the historical texts of the New Testament. as well on the next one. How we doing? Was that the last question? Did you want to come back on that? Sorry, I saw it.
Yeah. Oh, not on that, but on the
Okay.
one before.
Okay.
But what about in the Old Testament when God commands the Israelites to, pillage, rape, and destroy civilizations? And well, at one point he himself wipes out the entire population of the earth. That's God doing that. So did he just change his mind in the New Testament? Surely it's an infallible extreme being. He cannot change his mind. So I don't know what's going on there. Really.
Yeah, no, good question. So I'm just looking at, we'll cover this a bit tomorrow as well, so we'll give a more full response on this one tomorrow at 1 o'clock, and we'll look at this as an issue. So what about the Old Testament genocides that people talk about, the nation of Israel going into Canaan, wiping out people like that? It's difficult, isn't it? And I have to say as a Christian, I don't read those bits of the Bible and say, oh yes, it's really nice and easy. It's not. Actually, the Bible says ever since Genesis chapter 3, our world has been a very messed up place. And there isn't, I don't think, a simple one-sentence answer, so I can't give you, here's a simple answer. I think there are a number of factors that help make sense of it, possibly. So just bear with me for a couple of minutes on that. Firstly, I think we need to understand that what was taking place was not so much just arbitrary genocides, but when you read it in the context, God's saying, actually, this is judgment against specific countries because of some very specific things that are happening. So if you look at the kind of practices that were taking place in some of the Canaanite countries at the time, this wasn't just a kind of peaceful country minding their own business. This is a country that regularly practiced child sacrifice and stuff like that. So actually you're looking at a country that's become incredibly corrupt with some very evil practices. And God says, actually, if you continually reject me and you do that kind of stuff, there will be a judgment to come. And so God had been warning these nations, not just for a few weeks, actually we're told for a period of 400 years. If you don't turn, then there will ultimately be a day of judgment. So I won't turn a blind eye, and there will be a day of reckoning. And God warns them, and actually there are instances in the Old Testament where people are warned about impending judgments and they don't, or they do rather, respond to it. The story in Jonah is one of them, the city of Nineveh in Assyria. A city that responds to this challenge and this message of, there was a judgment to come, and they have spared the judgments that would have come. And so God doesn't just say arbitrarily, I want you to just go and wipe in a load of nations. And actually he particularly condemns the Israelites on some occasions when they did go and invade certain peoples who they were specifically told not to, because they weren't evil nations, they were actually quite peaceful nations, a nation in the north of Israel. And it's also, just let me finish the answer, I'd also say that what you've got going here is not kind of just a one-sided thing. It's not like God says, okay, I love Israel, I hate everyone else, I'm just going to protect the Israelites. So later on in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, God's people, turn away from God in similar ways and adopt similar practices to the nations that they had taken over the land from. And they too face God's judgments at the hands of the Assyrians first and then the Babylonian Empire. And so God is saying, actually, all sin and evil ultimately should be judged. And there is going to be a day of judgments. Now, what does that mean in the New Testament? Does God say, no, I don't care about sin and evil? No, he does say, I care. But there's two things the Bible says. Firstly, there will be an ultimate day of judgments. So if we continually reject God and live without him, there is a day when judgment and justice is done. And the second thing is, actually, we see in the cross of Jesus a God who is willing to take upon himself the judgment that we deserve. That he was saying, look, I'm willing to come and take what you deserve for the way that you rejected God so that you can be forgiven. Now there is the warning that if we reject that, then we still face the consequences ourselves, but we don't have to. God is saying, I'm willing to offer that forgiveness. Just as he was willing to in the Old Testament, to those that did, and we see examples of those that did, and he is today as well. Thank you. So I'm just conscious of the time. Really happy to keep on chatting, because I'm not sure there's a number of questions, but we are at 10:02. So just before we have a couple of notices before we finish, let me just say again, if you've got more questions, do stick around. We've got 20 minutes before the next lunch bar starts, so happy to sit and talk as much as you want. There's other people here too that are also guests of the Christian Union for the week, and they'll also happily chat and answer your questions to any degree, so that'll be fine. So do stick around for that. And do remember to fill in those feedback forms and leave them on the way out. But thank you. I'm back.
Great. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. Feel free to head off if you need to, but if not, do stick around for the second hour where the talk's going to be called Isn't the Bible Just an Unreliable Fabrication? So if that's something you really, you have a lot of questions about and you want to grapple with, do stick around because we're going to look at that issue together. Also, as well, tonight in Owens Park Source Cafe at 7:30, we're going to be looking at the issue of freedom. Am I really free? Is the big question we're going to look at tonight. So if that's something that you want to grapple with, come along. Acoustic Cafe is a chilled out environment for you to really get to grips with that. If that's something you would like to do. Remember, there's a bookstore at the back. All books are £1 if you're a guest of the CU. So go have a look at those. If might be something that can help you out over there. Remember to, we'd love you all to take the leaves off your chairs. They're a gift from us to you. We'd love you to take them and read them. And remember to fill in your feedback forms and drop them in the box at the back. It was great to have you. Thank you for coming. And enjoy the rest of your day. I don't know who's on singing the next album. I've got to go to the hall, but can I leave these with you?
I'm just going to go to